I have spent most of my life looking at numbers that other people preferred not to look at too closely. That habit made me a lot of money in stocks, but it also taught me something much more general than investing. A great many expensive mistakes begin with a number that is technically possible and emotionally appealing, but economically unsound. That is what I see when I look at a $500,000 house in America in 2026. People look at the front porch, the kitchen, the school district, the yard, the commute, the neighbors, the feeling of finally owning a place. I understand all of that. A home is emotional. It is where families sit at the dinner table, where children take their first steps, where people imagine safety, adulthood, respectability, and a future that feels settled. But money does not become more forgiving just because the dream is emotionally powerful. A bank can approve a loan that your nervous system cannot carry. That is the first thing I would want a young family to understand. Qualification is not affordability. Approval is not safety. Signing papers is not the same thing as owning a home with peace of mind. A great many people are being pushed toward a financial commitment that dominates the next decade of their lives, and they are being told it is normal because everyone around them is doing the same desperate arithmetic. I do not like that kind of arithmetic when I buy a business. I do not begin by asking how much strain I can endure before something breaks. I begin by asking whether the economics leave room for error, whether the enterprise can absorb surprises, whether I still sleep well if the world gets a little worse than I expected. That is what margin of safety means in the plainest possible language. It means I do not organize my life around the fantasy that nothing will go wrong. A house should be judged by the same standard. The market is not teaching people to think that way right now. The market is teaching people to think like gamblers with a mortgage calculator. It says $500,000 is normal. It says if comparable homes sold there, then the number must somehow make sense. It says if the bank approved you, then the burden must be manageable. It says if your parents bought a home at your age, you should be able to do it too. It says renting is throwing money away. It says stretching is adulthood. It says stress is simply the admission price for ownership. I have been around money too long to trust slogans that come from people who profit. When you say yes, the bank gets paid when the loan closes. The agent gets paid when the home sells. The insurer gets paid when the policy is bound. The system is designed to move you into the house. It is not designed to protect your future freedom. Those are very different objectives. So I would begin where most people refuse to begin, which is with the full cost of reality instead of the partial cost of aspiration. A $500,000 house used to sound like a big house. In many markets now, it buys you something much more ordinary than that. It may buy 1,200 square feet, a small yard, an old kitchen, a basement that needs work, beige carpet, aging systems, and a location that still requires a long commute. In many metro areas and in the orbit around many desirable cities, that number no longer buys luxury. It buys normal. That is exactly why the danger is so severe. People do not get into the deepest trouble when they are trying to buy a mansion they know they cannot afford. They get into trouble when the market persuades them that an expensive, ordinary thing is just the price of admission to a normal life. Now, let us look at the part that kills the dream for most households before they ever admit it is dead. The old gold standard was 20% down on a $500,000 house. That is $100,000 in cash. $100,000, people say the number so casually that they forget what it means. It means not hope, not future raises, not determination, not a budgeting app, not a vision board. It means cash. It means money already accumulated, already protected from emergencies, already separate from retirement, already separate from the closing costs and moving expenses that come after the offer is accepted. That down payment alone is farther away from most households than many people are willing to admit. If the typical savings balance is only a small fraction of that number, then telling a median household to go buy a $500,000 home is not guidance. It is theater. And even if a family is disciplined enough to save meaningfully, the clock is working against them. If a household earning roughly the middle of the American income distribution somehow saves 10% of gross pay each year, a feat that is much harder than people say when rent, groceries, insurance, transportation, and taxes are already swallowing the paycheck, then the time needed to accumulate a six-figure down payment stretches far beyond what most people imagine. And that assumes home prices stand still while they save, which is not how the real world tends to behave. So what happens? People bypass the old standard. They put down 5%, maybe 10% if they have been unusually disciplined or have had a little help. At that point, they enter the market the way many buyers now enter it. Not with safety, but with compromise disguised as progress. They put $50,000 down. That still sounds like a lot of money, because it is a lot of money. But on a $500,000 house, it leaves a $450,000 mortgage. Then comes the part that many people speak about in the tone of a footnote, even though it changes the whole life of the purchase. Interest rates, at rates in the 6 to 7% neighborhood, a $450,000 loan does not produce a payment that feels symbolic or manageable. It produces a principal and interest payment somewhere around $2,750 to $2,850 a month. Call it roughly $2,850, and that is before you have insured the house, taxed the house, maintained the house, or paid for the privilege of having been unable to put 20% down. That privilege has a name: PMI. Private mortgage insurance is one of those elegant bits of financial language that sounds harmless until you remember what it really is. You pay money because you are not wealthy enough to put enough money down, and the insurance protects the lender, not you. It is a monthly reminder that the transaction was engineered to proceed before your finances were truly ready. It might be $200, it might be $400, call it $300. As a working number already, you can see the deeper truth. The system does not merely allow people with thin margins to buy. It charges them extra for having thin margins. Now add property taxes depending on the market. You may see a range that works out to several $100s a month or much more. Use a conservative $500. Add homeowners insurance. In many places that number has risen with the risks of fire, flood, storm, and the general repricing of danger, call it $300. Then add maintenance, the category that optimistic buyers and sales professionals both prefer to push out of the conversation because it ruins the romance. Roofs age, water heaters burst, furnaces fail, pipes leak, foundations move, trees fall, appliances die, gates rot, driveways crack. A home is not a static object. It is a machine made of systems, and every system carries a timetable toward repair or replacement. A common rule of thumb is 1% of home value per year. On a $500,000 property, that is $5,000 a year, or roughly $417 a month. Now put the numbers together without sentiment: mortgage, around $2,850, property taxes, about $500, insurance, about $300, maintenance, about $417, PMI, about $300. You arrive at approximately $4,367 every month, and that assumes nothing dramatic breaks and no new special assessment appears. This is the point in the conversation where people start reaching for alternative definitions of affordable, because the honest definition is too painful. Financial prudence has long suggested that housing should not consume much more than around 28% of gross income. Banks often permit a much looser ratio once total debt is counted, something in the low 40s. Notice the difference between those standards. One is trying to preserve your life. The other is trying to preserve the loan. If you take $4,367 and ask what kind of income makes that a prudent housing payment, the number is sobering. At roughly 28% of gross income, you are looking at something like $187,000 a year. If you use the more permissive standard that lenders may tolerate, you still land around $150,000. Now ask the question that cuts through all the motivational language in the housing market. How many households earn that kind of money? Not most, not even close. The result is merciless. A $500,000 house is treated as ordinary in many markets, but the income needed to support it with any real margin of safety belongs to a minority of households. That means the market is effectively telling the majority of families to either accept severe financial strain, rely on outside help, take extraordinary risk, or stay out. The market then pretends this is a matter of personal grit. I have never liked systems that privatize the shame and socialize the delusion. If 80% of households cannot comfortably carry the number under reasonable standards, then the problem is not laziness. It is arithmetic colliding with culture. But most people do not experience this reality in percentages and charts. They experience it inside the details of a household budget. That is where the emotional damage happens. That is where the dream stops being abstract and starts taking bites out of sleep. Take a household earning $160,000 a year. On paper, that still sounds prosperous to a great many Americans. 2 educated professionals, good jobs, decent benefits, responsible people by the standards of public conversation. That family is supposed to be doing well. Yet after taxes, payroll deductions, and a modest retirement contribution, the actual monthly take-home may be something like $9,500. Subtract $4,367 for housing, and you have around $5,133 left. Plenty of people say, look at that number, how can that not be enough? Well, because life continues after the mortgage. 2 cars for 2 commuters, $800. Insurance for those cars, another $250 fuel. perhaps 300 student loans from the degrees required to get the incomes that made the mortgage possible in the first place. Call it 600 health insurance, premiums not fully covered by employers. 400 groceries for a household trying to eat reasonably well, perhaps 800 utilities. Internet, phones, water, gas, power. 450. What remains then is around $1,500, and that remainder is supposed to cover clothing, child expenses, school fees, small emergencies, medical copays, gifts, trips, tires, prescriptions, pet care, birthdays, occasional entertainment, seasonal costs, and any real saving beyond the most modest retirement contribution. That is how a family can look successful from the street and feel cornered at the kitchen table. And that is before anything actually goes wrong. The car needs brakes. The deductible on an accident appears. The air conditioning fails in July. The child needs dental work. A spouse loses hours. An elderly parent needs help. A job becomes intolerable. But quitting feels impossible because the mortgage has removed every form of mobility from the household. That is what being house poor means in practice. It does not mean you cannot physically make a payment for a while. It means the house has taken over the budget, taken over the psychology, taken over the family calendar, taken over the career choices, taken over the marriage conversations, taken over the margin that should have protected the household from ordinary life. I have seen a lot of people confuse assets with obligations. A house can absolutely be a good asset over time. A house can also become an obligation so heavy that it crowds out the very wealth building it was supposed to support. The distinction matters. A person may say, I am building equity, perhaps, but if the cost of that equity is that you stopped investing, stopped building liquid reserves, stopped taking career risks, stopped helping yourself in every other dimension, then the house is not functioning as a wealth machine. It is functioning as a confinement device. You are working for the house rather than the house working for you. That is a bad inversion. People also forget something I learned long ago from buying businesses. The best decisions are not merely those that survive the base case. They are those that survive the bad case. If your housing plan only works while both incomes remain intact, while interest rates stay where they are, while no large repair occurs, while no child-related expense spikes, while no parent needs help, while no job becomes unstable, while no vehicle fails, while no health issue emerges, then your plan does not really work. It is simply exposed to multiple sources of ruin. There is a difference between being optimistic and being over-leveraged. The culture has blurred that distinction. It now treats strain as maturity. It treats the inability to breathe as proof that you are serious. It treats the permanent absence of margin as a rite of passage. It turns phrases like building equity into a kind of moral perfume sprayed over a deeply fragile balance sheet. I do not buy that. The truth is much harsher and much simpler. If the only way to own the house is to sacrifice liquidity, flexibility, savings, sleep, and optionality, then the purchase price is not the sticker on the listing. The purchase price is the next 10 years of your life. That is too high a price for most households. And notice something else. The people encouraging the stretch often compare the present with the past in a dishonest way. They say previous generations bought homes with less income, as though that settles the argument. But if prior generations bought homes at much lower multiples of household income, at lower relative costs, with a different relationship between wages and prices, then invoking those older outcomes as proof that the current burden is normal is absurd. The math changed. House prices climbed far faster than incomes over long stretches of time. The monthly carrying costs changed. Insurance changed. Taxes changed. Maintenance on aging housing stock changed. The relationship between job stability and housing commitments changed. Pretending nothing changed is another way of hiding the arithmetic. When arithmetic becomes unbearable, industries tend to replace it with stories. One story says that renting is throwing money away. That is a seductive phrase because it flatters the speaker. It suggests that ownership is always disciplined and renting is always wasteful. But a great many homeowners throw money away too. They throw it away through interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, transaction costs, stress purchases, poor timing, underfunded repairs, and the destruction of financial flexibility. Some people rent and invest with discipline. Some people buy and suffocate. There is no virtue in ownership by itself. The virtue lies in sound economics. Another story says that houses always go up. Well, over long periods, many things tend to rise in nominal value. That does not rescue a family whose monthly budget is broken. Appreciation is not a sedative for anxiety. Appreciation does not replace a failed roof in the year you are short on cash. Appreciation does not help the couple who cannot move because selling costs, market conditions, and credit damage make retreat expensive. Another story says that if you can just get in, you will figure it out. That is the language of people who confuse survival with wisdom. Plenty of people survive bad decisions. That does not make the decisions good. A person can white-knuckle a bad purchase for years and still call it a blessing because the alternative feels too painful to admit. Rationalization is one of the cheapest products in the market. I do not want families buying houses they can only defend through rationalization. I want them buying houses that still make sense after the excitement fades and the ordinary bills arrive. There is also a moral pressure around home ownership that is rarely discussed. Honestly, buying a home has been wrapped in the language of success, adulthood, stability, and belonging. Renting, by contrast, is often portrayed as immature waiting, a temporary state, a failure to plant roots, a sign that you have not yet arrived. That cultural pressure matters because people do not make financial decisions in a vacuum. They make them while looking sideways at friends, parents, siblings, co-workers, social media, and the quietly humiliating feeling that adulthood has become a moving target they cannot reach. When people feel that kind of shame, they stop asking whether the purchase is smart. They start asking whether they can bear another year of feeling behind. That is a dangerous substitution. Money decisions made to relieve social pain are often the worst money decisions. I would rather disappoint a real estate agent than disappoint my future self. I would rather look cautious in public than live panicked in private. I would rather wait than buy a cage and call it a milestone. That is not anti-homeownership. That is pro-freedom. Freedom is the real thing wealth is supposed to buy. A house that leaves you no breathing room is not freedom. It is just a more socially acceptable form of financial entrapment. Let me state it in the most direct way I can. For a large majority of households, a $500,000 house is not affordable under honest math, especially at the carrying costs people face now. Not tight, not a little aggressive, not uncomfortable for a year or two. Not something you fix with coffee at home and fewer restaurant meals, not something you solve with motivational slogans. It is structurally misaligned with income. That matters because when misalignment becomes normal, entire populations begin to organize their lives around strain. They delay retirement saving, they underinsure, they overuse credit cards, they defer maintenance, they stay in jobs that are slowly consuming them, they do not move when better opportunities arise, they stop building cash reserves, they mistake immobility for responsibility, and then the system looks at the wreckage and tells them to budget better. I have a low tolerance for that sort of hypocrisy. If the issue were a little carelessness at the margins, then personal discipline would solve it. But you cannot discipline your way out of a 6 times income home price with mid-single digit or higher mortgage rates and a full stack of non-mortgage costs piled on top. You cannot hustle your way into safety when the structure itself requires a minority-level income to buy what is being advertised as ordinary shelter. You cannot use better habits to erase a broken ratio. And because the ratio is broken, the only sane response for many households is not heroic sacrifice. It is realism. Realism may mean renting longer. Realism may mean buying a smaller house. Realism may mean leaving a market you love. Realism may mean refusing to anchor your self-respect to a deed. Realism may mean admitting that a house at that price does not improve your life, even if it improves your image. Those are not signs of defeat. They are signs that you understand the purpose of money. The purpose of money is not to maximize appearances. The purpose of money is to improve the quality of your decisions, increase your resilience, and widen your options. I like liquid assets because they give a person alternatives. I like businesses with strong cash generation because they create choices. I like balance sheets that can absorb shocks because I know shocks are inevitable. I feel the same way about a household. The strongest household is not necessarily the one with the biggest house. It is the one with enough margin that a surprise bill does not become a family crisis, enough savings that a job change does not become a terror event, enough flexibility that children, health, parents, and market cycles can be handled without financial panic. Margin is underrated because it is invisible from the curb. A neighbor can see the siding, the driveway, the square footage, the landscaping. They cannot see the credit card balances rising in the background. They cannot see the arguments about money. They cannot see the retirement contributions that stop. They cannot see the dread that accompanies every strange noise the furnace makes. That is why housing narratives are so often deceptive. They are built around visible status and invisible stress. I prefer invisible strength to visible status. Now consider something almost nobody says aloud when discussing houses at this price level. The common advice often frames ownership as a path to wealth, but wealth is not created merely by owning something expensive. Wealth is created when assets compound without forcing you into fragility. If the mortgage consumes so much income that you cannot invest consistently, if the non-mortgage costs grow faster than expected, if maintenance becomes chronic, if taxes and insurance rise, if your earnings do not scale, then the home may appreciate on paper while your broader financial life stagnates. The asset rises. The owner remains strained. That is not the kind of compounding I admire. A well-bought house can absolutely contribute to long-term financial health. But the phrase well-bought does a tremendous amount of work. It means bought at a scale your household can actually support, bought with enough liquidity left over, bought without betting your future on perfect stability, bought in a way that leaves room for investing, saving, living, and adapting. Most people are not being encouraged to think in those terms. They are being told to chase the maximum number a lender will allow and then call the result normal. That is like asking a bridge how much weight it can carry before collapse and then driving exactly that amount across every day while congratulating yourself on homeownership. A prudent person would not do that with a bridge. I do not know why so many are being told to do it with a family balance sheet. The answer, of course, is incentives. Incentives explain more human behavior than almost anything else, and they explain this housing conversation too. The broker is rewarded for closing the loan, not for your peace of mind 5 years later. The seller is rewarded for the highest price, not for the buyer's margin of safety. The agent is rewarded when you transact, not when you decide the numbers are dangerous. The entire machinery surrounding home purchases is wired to move you toward yes. That is why you need an internal voice strong enough to say no. Saying no is financially underrated. A person who can say no to a bad deal protects more future wealth than a person who says yes to a glamorous one. There is no prize for owning a house that ruins your budget. There is no trophy for spending half your take-home pay on housing and calling it discipline. There is no medal for turning your life into a payment schedule. There is no wisdom in paying extra monthly fees because you were rushed into a purchase before your finances were ready. There is no dignity in pretending strain is success because the mailbox is now on your property. The most valuable thing you can preserve in personal finance is not status. It is the ability to choose. Can you choose to leave a bad job? Can you choose to help a family member without destabilizing yourself? Can you choose to absorb a repair without debt? Can you choose to invest through a downturn instead of liquidating out of necessity? Can you choose peace over panic? A house that devours all spare cash removes those choices, one by one. That is why I would tell a family to stop fixating on what the lender says they can do and start asking a much sterner question. After the full cost of the house, after taxes, after insurance, after maintenance, after transportation, after food, after health care, after child expenses, after some realistic saving, after a reserve for the things life always throws at you. Is there still breathing room? If the answer is no, then the house is too expensive. Even if the lender smiles and the market insists it is normal, especially then in investing, most great disasters do not arrive with a trumpet. They begin with a small concession to optimism. A buyer says earnings will improve soon. A manager says leverage is fine at these rates. A household says we will pick up more income later. Another says we will build the emergency fund after we move in. Another says we will refinance when rates come down. Another says we can handle the maintenance as it comes. Another says the house will go up enough that it will all work out. Individually, those sentences sound harmless. Collectively, they form the architecture of fragility. I have learned to distrust situations that require multiple favorable outcomes merely to feel normal. A sensible purchase should not need future raises, lower rates, stable employment, no major repairs, good health, no family emergencies, and flawless self-control all at once. That is too many IFs. And the house market at this level asks too many households to live inside those IFs. People also underestimate the psychological burden of a payment that never relaxes. Housing costs arrive every month with the authority of law. A missed dinner out changes nothing. A missed mortgage payment changes everything. That asymmetry matters. It changes how people think. It changes what risks they can take. It changes what they fear. It changes how resilient they feel. A large, inflexible monthly obligation is not just a financial number. It is a permanent claim on your emotional bandwidth. When that claim is too large, life gets narrower, narrower choices, narrower dreams, narrower tolerance for uncertainty, narrower capacity for generosity, narrower patience, narrower courage. You can watch a household shrink under the weight of a house it was told it could afford. I do not find that admirable. I find it tragic. So what should people do with this reality? First, they should stop confusing affordability with possibility. Almost anything is possible for a while. That is the wrong question. The right question is whether the purchase allows a life that still contains resilience and dignity after the novelty of ownership disappears. Second, they should calculate the entire monthly burden, not just principal and interest. Anyone who quotes the mortgage payment alone is either naïve or selling something. Third, they should recognize that a down payment is not the finish line. It is the opening condition. Closing costs come, repairs come, furnishings come. Moving comes, the house begins demanding money before the boxes are fully unpacked. Fourth, they should judge the purchase under adversity, not under perfect conditions. Assume something will go wrong because something always does. Fifth, they should separate the desire to own from the ability to own without becoming fragile. Wanting a thing and carrying a thing are not the same. Sixth, they should stop treating renting as moral failure. A renter with cash flow, investments, and options may be in a stronger financial position than an owner with a strained balance sheet and no flexibility. Seventh, they should remember that the housing market does not owe them emotional validation. It offers terms. You are allowed to reject those terms. A lot of the anger surrounding housing right now comes from people who intuitively feel this gap between what is called normal and what is actually sustainable. They look at ordinary houses with extraordinary prices and feel as though the whole country has lost the thread. In many respects it has. When a market expects median households to finance homes at ratios that crush flexibility, something important is broken. The polite language for that is affordability crisis. The lived language for that is simpler. You do not earn enough to buy what is being sold as ordinary, and everyone keeps acting like the problem is your mindset. That would irritate me too. But irritation is not strategy. Clear thinking is strategy, and clear thinking leads many people to the same uncomfortable conclusion. A $500,000 home is not the smart move for them right now. Regardless of what the culture says, that may mean looking at $350,000 instead. That may mean choosing a smaller place. That may mean moving farther out. That may mean moving to a different state. That may mean waiting for better conditions. That may mean renting and investing the difference with discipline. All of those choices are more respectable than signing up for years of strain, simply to prove something to strangers. I never cared much for proving things to strangers. One of the quiet advantages of financial strength is that it makes you less vulnerable to social pressure. When you have liquidity and patience, you do not have to lunge at the first expensive symbol of adulthood placed in front of you. You can wait, you can think, you can compare alternatives, you can accept that timing matters, you can treat a house like a major capital allocation rather than a spiritual referendum on your maturity. That is exactly how it should be treated. A home purchase is one of the largest financial decisions most families will ever make. It should be approached with the seriousness of a large business acquisition, not the fever of an auction for emotional security. In a business, if the carrying costs were too high, the margins too thin, the balance sheet too exposed, and the future dependent on optimistic assumptions, I would walk away. I would do the same with a house. Sometimes the wisest financial act in an overheated market is refusal. Refusal protects capital. Refusal protects peace. Refusal keeps you from confusing motion with progress. Refusal keeps your life from becoming a hostage to one oversized line item. I understand why the refusal feels painful. People want roots, they want stability, they want to feel they have joined a club that the culture has spent decades glorifying. They are tired of rent increases, tired of uncertain landlords, tired of feeling as if they are building someone else's wealth. I do not dismiss those frustrations, but pain alone does not convert a bad purchase into a good one. And there is another illusion buried inside the homeownership conversation. People speak as though ownership itself ends uncertainty. It does not. It changes the form of uncertainty. The renter worries about renewal terms. The owner worries about roofs, taxes, insurance, repairs, rates, neighborhood decline, and the immense cost of being wrong. Ownership can stabilize some risks while introducing others. That is why the only sensible way to buy is with enough margin that the risks can be carried. Without that, the house becomes a machine for converting external uncertainty into internal stress. I would rather face some external uncertainty while keeping my internal balance sheet strong. That is why the phrase house poor always struck me as too mild. It sounds almost quaint, as though it describes an annoying but harmless stage of adulthood. In reality, it often means a household that has traded its flexibility for an address. It means a family that is one unpleasant surprise away from debt. It means adults who cannot change jobs, cannot save properly, cannot absorb shocks, and cannot enjoy the house they worked so hard to acquire. What kind of dream is that? Not one I would buy. If you are below the income level that makes the payment obviously comfortable, the decision is not merely financial, it is existential. You are deciding whether your future self will live with space or with compression. Space means choices. Compression means excuses. Space means resilience. Compression means constant calculation. Space means being able to say yes when opportunity appears and no when a bad deal presents itself. Compression means every decision is filtered through the mortgage first. A $500,000 home may be normal in many markets now, but normal prices do not create normal affordability. They simply create normalized strain. That is why I want people to be colder than the culture and kinder to themselves. Be colder in the math. Be kinder in the judgment. Do not call yourself a failure because an overpriced market asks you to take on a burden that does not fit your income. Do not let a lender's willingness to expose you to stress convince you that the stress is sensible. Do not mistake being able to endure something for benefiting from it. Do not assume that because many people are doing it, many people are doing it well. A society can normalize a bad trade for a long time before admitting it was bad. You do not have to wait for that admission. You can make the honest calculation now. You can recognize that there is no shame in saying the number does not work. You can understand that financial adulthood is not the act of maximizing debt. It is the act of making reality-based decisions with enough humility to reject the ones that damage your future. That is a better definition of maturity than a house key. A great many people would be wealthier, calmer, and freer if they bought less house. Later, with more cash, and only after the full burden fit comfortably inside a broader plan that may not sound exciting. It sounds sensible. I have always found sensible more profitable than exciting. Exciting sells houses. Sensible keeps families solvent. And when I look at a $500,000 house through that lens, I do not ask whether the dream is understandable. Of course it is. I ask whether the economics honor the life that must be lived after the closing for most households. Under honest assumptions, the answer is no. No, the payment is not comfortably supported. No, the down payment is not easily assembled. No, the maintenance burden is not trivial. No, the budget will not remain flexible. No, the emotional strain is not a side issue. No, the bank's approval does not make the purchase wise. No, there is no hidden prize for joining the ranks of the house poor, and no, refusing the transaction is not failure. Sometimes refusing the transaction is the first act of real financial intelligence. If the house requires you to gamble on future income, ignore maintenance, tolerate chronic stress, underfund savings, and call fragility adulthood. Then the problem is not your courage. The problem is the deal. Walk away from bad deals. That is a rule that serves people well in every part of life. If enough households remembered that rule, a lot fewer would wake up inside expensive homes, wondering why the dream feels so much like a burden. The number on the listing is not the only number that matters. The real number is the amount of your life the house will consume. On a $500,000 home in this environment, that number is far too large for far too many people. That is not cynicism. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike housing culture, does not care what story you want to tell yourself. It only tells you what the burden really is. If you are wise, you listen to it before you sign.